I am Jamie Condliffe. I was actually at Magdalen and in the final academic year that Brian actually taught when he was teaching undergrads. So, please. Thank you. So I had the privilege of being taught by him as an undergrad in his college rooms, and then also ended up working with him. So I did my PhD here at Oxford, working on some of the needle-free injection projects too. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about both of those things now. I first met Brian, I should say as well, I'm no longer an academic in academia at all. I'm actually a journalist. So this talk might be a bit different to everyone else's. Hopefully it's got a little bit of a story to it, but we'll see if that works. So I first met Brian at Magdalen College. Actually, first met Brian in Magdalen College bar. I don't know whether everyone's familiar with the admissions process at Oxford, but it definitely always used to be the case that students turned up for their interview, maybe stayed here for a few days, and that's still the case in the humanities. You come and you kind of socialise with other students, you go to a few interviews throughout the course of your visit, and stay in college rooms. That kind of stopped happening in engineering because the academics developed an algorithm that allowed them to fit in all the interviews in a single day. So the process was optimized, and you showed up, you did your first interview at your first choice college, and then an hour or two later you did your second interview at a different college, and you could come and go in the same day. But for whatever reason, that wasn't really communicated to me. So I turned up and was invited to go along to the college bar for drinks to meet the tutors and the other students that were being interviewed. And as I turned up in Magdalen College bar, an empty college bar, save for 3 people, and that was Brian, Zong Yu, another tutor at Magdalen, and Byron Byrne, who sat up in the audience, and me. So Brian bought me a pint, and I sat down and had to nervously discuss my personal statement for about half an hour, 45 minutes. I honestly I cannot remember a single thing that was said. Byron might be able to remember some of it. It was probably deeply embarrassing for all concerned. And the next day, I toddled along to my interviews in Swithin's Quad. So Brian's teaching rooms, I think either that bay or the one just this side. I toddled along to my interviews, and the interviews were in 2 separate rooms. So there were back-to-back interviews, one with Zong Yu, and then a second one with Byron and Brian. Went into my first interview, did some questions, was asked to think about the forces acting on a car as it went around a corner, and to try and work out when it would tip over on its wheels. And then I went into the second room and was asked the exact same question. And faced with the moral dilemma of whether I should admit that I'd just been asked that question, or yeah. I did actually admit that I had been asked that question, and was asked a fiendishly difficult graph sketching question instead. And at the end of the interview, I actually, as I stood up to walk out and leave the room, I'd actually spent the last 2 or 3 months off school with glandular fever. And I turned to Brian and I said, I just wanted to check that my school had let you know that I've been off and had glandular fever, so I've not really been studying, so I might not be at my best. And he just looked up and he said, no, they didn't tell us, and looked straight back down. I got a place, clearly, so it all turned out okay. Sadly, I say sadly, I turned up the following academic year and was taught by Brian for that first year before he retired as a tutor. And I found it totally inspirational. I have like really incredibly vivid memories of sitting down at a table with him. He would sit right in the middle of the table. There would be 2 empty seats either side of him. He'd welcome in the 2 students, and he would have a piece of paper in front of him, his little propelling pencil, and he would proceed to meticulously do these work solutions in front of us. And it's not a kind of teaching technique that really works for everyone. It doesn't really take any prisoners. But just seeing him kind of be able to do this like really wonderful maths in front of you totally bowled me over. I thought it was amazing, and it really, really inspired me. And I was really, really sad when he announced that he wouldn't be teaching the following year. However, Constantine, who's sat at the end of the row here, took over his role and then proceeded to teach me math in the second and third year. And fortunately, he was equally inspirational. And no, that's true. I mean, genuinely, he to the point at which Constantine managed to encourage me to do my fourth year research in his lab, and I basically ended up working in the MEU 43 Banbury Road, whatever you want to call it, to do my fourth year project. And that actually was working on some of the needle-free injection projects, and that turned into my PhD research as well. So I'm going to talk briefly about that now. This is 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, and I stopped doing research in 2009, so bear with me if if it doesn't go so well. Needle-free injection. Okay. So I actually was co-funded by Particle Therapeutics during my PhD, which was the third spin-out, I think, of the same IP. So the idea here is very similar kind of device using that kind of that gas cartridge to fire high-velocity particles at the skin. That's what it was supposed to look like. I was given this. Yeah, a milled plastic tube, and on some kind of contraption, quite Heath Robinson. But being an engineer, well, being engineers, we weren't actually doing these experiments with skin most of the time. If you can see a lump of acrylic at the bottom, on top of that is just a piece of agar, like the kind of material that you grow bacteria on in Petri dishes. And what we'd do is we'd take some polystyrene particles and put them into a cassette, put them into the device and fire them into this agar. And we've seen kind of those fluid flows that Mark showed us. And if you looked at how those particles kind of came out of the device, what you saw if you actually looked at the footprint of those particles after they're being fired into agar or paper or whatever, was that they kind of sit in this donut shape. And then we could try and work out how they penetrated the target that were fired at too. And actually the method that was used to do that was to take a razor blade and slice up this piece of agar, lay each one individually onto a microscope slide, look at them under a microscope, and then digitally measure the penetration depth. Right? So these things penetrate to a couple of hundred microns, about the width of, 4 or 5 human hairs. But that's incredibly labour intensive. And when it came to kind of trying to look at it in skin, this is a piece of pig skin that's had some particles injected into it, and it actually became really tricky to even see where they'd gone. So these are some of the kind of particles that you can inject, right? So that's a polystyrene particle that looks lovely. These are some kind of freeze-dried particles that were glucagon that you could fire in that would dissolve as well. So the idea was, how can we work out where these particles are, what they're doing, what they're like, and find some other way than just kind of slicing it up and looking under a microscope. So journalistically, where are they? What are they doing? How are they doing it? How are they behaving? So we needed to find out their position. We wanted to find out their size to see how they penetrated and try and marry that up with the kind of conditions they were fired under and their properties. And we also wanted to try and think about, if you inject those salt particles that start itching and bleeding, why are they doing that? So basically kind of what's happening to them once they're inside the skin. So I'll just talk briefly about a few of those things. We decided to do all of that using scanning acoustic microscopy, which is basically ultrasound. So you're thinking about taking a piece of agar, popping some particles inside it by firing them in needle-free injection, taking a transducer, which is just like a very high-frequency microphone and speaker combined, and basically then firing pulses of sound at the particles, listening for the returns, and then trying to analyze that signal and see what happens. And then if you scan your transducer across the entire footprint, then hopefully you could try and infer something about what happened. So we built a system to do that, and unlike all those dreadfully old-fashioned computers that we were talking about earlier, I think I actually had a Dell gaming PC to power mine. May have played Counter-Strike on it for any of the younger members of the audience. So basically, there's this water tank that's got the sample in, and we scan the transducer around, log the data on the PC, and then process it. Oh, rogue animation. Okay. So, where, what, and how? Where are they? We're going to try and look at the penetration depth. So, if you do send a pulse of ultrasound at a piece of agar with some particles in, you get some echoes. You get a first echo from the surface of the agar as it hits, and then you get some echoes back from the particles lying beneath. And that's what you can see in this kind of time trace. So that first little ping is a reflection from the surface of the agar, and then those later emissions are bits of sound being scattered back from the particles. And we could do some fancy signal processing to look at where the surface was and define that, and then we could look at where the particles lay beneath. And if you measured that across the entire surface, then you could come up with numbers, basically, that would show you the average penetration depth, the standard deviation. And so, as well as doing it optically, by slicing up the agar and looking at it under a microscope, we could do it acoustically as well. And it turned out that it actually worked quite well. So that was something. And then if you look at the, and then if you look at, if you take all those data points and look at where the depth over the entire footprint instead, you remember that picture I showed you at the start, looked like a donut shape, fewer particles at the middle, more particles in the kind of like ring around. And if you look at the acoustic data, that basically had the same signature. You see low penetration depth in the middle, high penetration depth around in a ring. And then you can try and look at the same thing in skin. You actually find that it's quite a lot harder to do in skin. Agar, obviously kind of totally homogeneous. Skin's very complex, it's got many layers. If you look at the kind of traces that you get back from something in skin, it's full of noise. And if you look at the images, you can see that's an agar sample with some particles in. That's a skin sample with some particles in. It became a much harder problem. So it didn't work quite as well, but if you actually look at the penetration depth and the standard deviation of those in skin, then it kind of works fairly well. And then we tried to work out how we could think about the size of these particles. I think we've spoken a bit about how different masses of particles penetrate to different depths, because so the mass affects how far they penetrate, the size affects how far they penetrate. What's interesting about this time trace is this second pulse, which is to do with the sound being reflected from the particle. If you actually look at that, you can do fancy things with it to kind of understand some of the properties of the particle that's reflecting the sound. If you actually look at the frequency content of that bit of sound, it has this unique signature with these resonance points. And then by doing some more complicated mathematics using Bessel functions, I think. Not totally sure I can remember what a Bessel function is. You can theoretically predict what that frequency response should look like. And actually, if you do that, then you see very similar resonance peaks. And by changing the parameters in the theoretical model, you can basically force those peaks to line up with the experimental results and kind of work out the size of the particles in your sample. And we did that, and that worked too. That was good. And then we could think about how they changed as well. So what we were thinking about here was if we take those salt particles and we inject them into something that's kind of basically, essentially water, they're going to dissolve, right? And if they dissolve, they're going to change size. And so if you look at the return that you get from a salt particle that's been embedded in skin or agar, and the magnitude of the signal changes over time as the particle dissolves. And again, if you look at those kind of frequency responses, you can see those kind of resonances change over time too. Basically, that allowed us to work out what the size of the particle was at the start and work out how long it took for it to dissolve. And then you can compare that to some theoretical modeling. And if you compare the theoretical model to the acoustic results, then they marry up really nicely. So that was my PhD thesis in 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I looked up how many citations my PhD thesis had about half an hour ago just to check. A single citation since it's published in 2009 by someone that I used to work with in my lab. Does that count? Better than me citing it? I'm not quite sure. When I had my viva for my PhD, one of my examiners commented that it was of an unusually high literary standard. Implicit in that statement, I think, was an unusually high literary standard for an engineering thesis. The bar is quite low. So I naturally decided to pursue a career in journalism instead. Actually, what I did was I decided that I only had 2 degrees and I should probably have a third. So I went to Imperial and did a science journalism degree. Then got a job at New Scientist, then got a job at a technology website called Gizmodo, and now find myself news editor at MIT Technology Review, which you may or may not know. I mean, it's an American publication. It's based out of MIT. It's a bit like Harvard Business Review, but about emerging technology. So I'm the only staffer working in Europe. So I cover kind of AI, robotics, computing in Europe. And we do a bunch of cool stuff. We publish a magazine every 2 months. We have a website that is kind of chock full of emerging tech news. And one of the big projects that I've worked on is launching a kind of daily news digest email, which goes out at about lunchtime in the UK or first thing in the morning on the East Coast. And the whole point of that is to try and contextualize tech news in the wider world. So the idea is that people that are too busy and too important to read 10, 20, 30 websites every morning can read the email and kind of digest what they need to know about tech and its place in the world. And that is about to bring me full circle to Brian in a roundabout way. Because I think that's really important, this idea of contextualizing the work that is done by all you guys, right? You're kind of wonderful academics. But people need to understand how that fits into the wider context in the world. And I think it's fair to say that it's a direct result of having been taught by Brian and being encouraged to kind of pursue that kind of research during my PhD, that I now continue to teach. So I teach at Imperial. I teach on the science journalism course that I did, and I'm also a college lecturer at Brasenose and at Pembroke, where I teach the Engineering and Society course. And I can kind of only really hope that when I'm stood at my whiteboard, hopefully not quite as intimidatingly as Brian, helping these students learn, that they're taking on board some of this knowledge in a way that he helped me to. And that's it, really. So thanks, Brian, because I don't think I'd be doing this without you.